Alright guys, today we're reviewing the vintage Longines Conquest and also comparing it to the Orient Bambino and why I think this beautiful champagne dialed gold plated dress watch is the ultimate alternative and a bit of Orient Bambino killer. Now to give you some context, the Orient Bambino has a special place in the watch community's heart. It is one of the gateways for a lot of people to get into the hobby. Not as celebrated as a gateway as the Seiko SKX, but many people thank the Orient Bambino for getting into the hobby. Now, before I carry on, just going to have a quick wrist shot of what I'm wearing today, and that's a Seiko Saab 035. It's the ivory dial variant, because I am a contrarian with the bracelet, but I will be changing the bracelet for a Jubilee aftermarket strap review coming soon. Now back to the topic of reviewing this Longines Conquest from the 1970s and comparing it to the Orient Bambino. We'll be breaking this review / mini comparison down to 3 sections. Those 3 sections will be value, style and negatives. Just going to put on the watch for you whilst we talk about value. Now cash rules everything around me, so let's talk about money, because this will really frame the comparison well, I think. The Orient Bambino is priced at around £150, give or take. You will find some on Amazon, for example, for cheaper, but there are some going for closer to 200. And it's the same price for this Longines Conquest. I got it for £150, inclusive of post and packaging. And I think your target price, if you're looking for one of these, is £150 to £250, depending on condition. So they're pretty much the same price, particularly in this case, but for value for money, you get the Longines brand name on your wrist. For those who don't know, Longines was the Rolex rival in the 1950s, much like Omega today. Now, if we're talking modern Longines, they still hold a lot of that brand power they had in the 1950s. They're seen as more of a mid-tier brand. Some people see it as a luxury brand, but definitely if you're looking for a modern Longines, cost you at least £1,000 or thereabouts. So value for money, I think it's all on the Longines side. People hail the Orient Bambino for having great value for money because it's an in-house movement. This too has an in-house movement. It's a manual wound, high frequency caliber 6952, which, you know, if you had to pick one, I'm picking the Longines in-house movement. That's manual wound. I know some people don't prefer the manual winding, but personally, I think you get more of a connection to that watch and it really gives you that vintage feel. So I'm going to take it off again and let's talk about the style, and I'll give you the case dimensions here. Now, I'll do the Conquest first as I have it to hand, and it is 37mm in diameter, 9mm case thickness, and that is acrylic. That's 40mm lug to lug, that's top to bottom, and 18mm lug width for this aftermarket strap. Now, even though this is a small watch, this gold-plated cushion case gives it so much presence on the wrist. It really wears more like a 38 or 39mm, and it's another winner for the Longines Conquest from the 1970s, probably 1971, I think. But it's another winner for the Longines in style, because the Orient Bambino, the reason why I don't have it today is because, in my opinion, it's a dive watch pretending to be a dress watch. It's just too big. In comparison, the Bambino would be 42mm across. That's huge for a dress watch. 12.5mm thick, lug to lug, 48.5mm, again huge for a dress watch, and lug width of 22mm, again too big. There's a dive watch specs. Now you can find an older version of the Bambino that's slightly smaller, but only slightly. It's still too big for my 6.5-inch wrist, and I think most of you would agree with that. Now there's also another problem. I'm not going to bash the Bambino too much, but last one, Another problem with the Bambino, it's got the Bambino curse, I call it, that domed acrylic crystal, which is really a scratch magnet. So instead, I'd suggest doing your homework and having a look out for the Longines Conquest. This one's from the 70s. I really do love the ones from the 70s, so I highly recommend them. It just looks like pure money. I'm going to wear it on my wedding day because it's such a good watch. So much presence on the wrist. So, last category, let's talk about the negatives. Now, vintage watches are always risky. My advice would be there's a million traps to fall for in the vintage market, so be careful. But the biggest tip is you're buying the seller as well as the watch, not just the watch. So find one you trust, which you can go back to time and time again, and you should have no problems. But I'll probably make a video one day on the vintage traps to look out for. Another negative about the vintage Longines Conquest is servicing. This one has unknown service history. So when you hear that, it's probably in need of a service. But surprisingly, it is keeping time well. So this one's okay for the time being, but I will need to get it serviced, which does bump up the price. If you're lucky, you might find one with a fair price with a decent service history, but there's a bit of luck involved with these vintage watches. Another potential negative is that it's manual wound. You might like manual wound. Personally, I do, but I know a lot of people would prefer an automatic watch like the Orient Bambino. Now, the last negative to look out for is you need to know a thing or two about vintage watches to avoid the repainted dials, the Franken watches, and so on. But don't get overcharged. A lot of people will repaint the dial and charge you way more for it. These, I'd say target price 150 to 250, but I've seen some people really take the mick and price these vintage Longines watches at over £1,000, close to £1,000. I mean, some of them may be, worth more like a sports chief, but this one, vintage Longines Conquest, target price, don't pay more than 250 in my opinion. 150 depending on condition like this. As you can see, the crown here is the gold plated has been taken off a bit because it's been wound so much in its life cycle. There are scratches, little bits of bashes here and there, but it's still okay. That gold plated still catches the light so well, that champagne dial. I actually like the fact that the hour markers and the hands, those batten hands, have a bit of wear and tear to it. You can really tell that this is vintage, and of course vintage is the new wave. That brings me to my conclusion. So I'll leave you with a bit of controversy to keep things interesting. Dress watches are made for suit and tie occasions. Obviously you can wear it whenever you want, but they're built for suit and tie occasions. So ideally you want a bit of brand power on your wrist. And for £150, Longines offers the most brand power on the wrist. And no offense to Orient, but I don't think outside of watch enthusiasts it offers really any brand power. But they are really good looking watches in fairness. So the Orient Bambino is a great entry-level dress watch, but has a huge flaw. It looks like a dinner plate on the wrist, and in a suit and tie, it's going to be a scratch magnet if you're wearing it out and about, having a drink or two. As you know, you've been on YouTube and you've looked on watch content if you're here. Vintage is really hot right now. It's the new wave, and these prices are creeping up for vintage across the board, including the vintage Longines Conquest. So I'd say pick one up whilst you still can. If you think the Bambino is too big for you, or you're looking for an alternative. Basically, if you're going to dress like Bruce Wayne in a suit and tie, you're going to want something that makes you feel like Bruce Wayne on the wrist. And that's where the Longines Conquest date comes in. So let me know if you can think of a better Bambino alternative that isn't a dinner plate.